Time to go. So, welcome to the webinar on problematic math of college admissions. My name is Dave Kung. I'm the director of policy at the Charles A. Dana Center at UT Austin. This is a joint production of us and Tipsy Math and Just Equations, and a lot of people chipping in. And so thanks to everybody behind the scenes for making this happen. And thank you all for coming. When I think about this, when I think about the issue of admissions, I think back to some of the work we did in the summer of 2020. You know, we got math chairs. We call it math chairs for racial justice, and we were meeting regularly after the murder of George Floyd. And some of the things that came up in those conversations were really great about digging into to policies, procedures, practices that were sort of on the face of it that seemed totally reasonable, but if you like dug deeper, it turns out they were sort of deeply problematic, and in many cases sort of really racially biased, either racially biased themselves, or they were just sort of baking into the system the racial biases and inequalities that came into the system before them. And so I think that this is another example. I think college admissions, we should really view some of the things that are going on in college admissions in that same light. So I welcome you to this discussion, and hopefully I'm really thrilled to see so many people who are interested in this topic, and hopefully together, working together, we can all sort of move the needle on this, which is a really difficult problem. We're going to introduce the panelists for today's session. As I introduce this, I'm reminded of this thing we had going on. Like when I was an undergraduate, there was this sort of rule of thumb I had about my upper division math classes that generally there were more people named Dave than there were women in in the class. And I think we've managed to put together another panel that's like that. And so we're going to have to use some like last names, or at least I'm the only one here who's Dave, but I wanted to introduce everybody else, and just if you could unmute and say hi to everybody, and just say where you're coming from. David Brasood, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, here from St. Paul, Minnesota.
Thanks, and I'm working from a different list. Now I'm looking at the screen. Veronica Anderson, we were supposed to go in alphabetical order. Veronica, you want to say hello?
Yes, hello everyone, coming in from Oakland, California.
And can you tell us, Veronica, the group you're working with?
Yes, I'm with Penultimate Group. I'm an independent consultant, writer, and researcher.
Excellent. Pam, hello, welcome.
I'll go next.
Yeah.
Let's do David Hawkins first.
Okay, David Hawkins.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I'm David Hawkins. I'm the Chief Education and Policy Officer with the National Association for College Admission Counseling. We refer to ourselves as NACAC, so if you hear that later, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And I've been here for 23 years, so enjoying the time spent with college admission officers, and really excited to be talking about this issue today.
And we are thrilled to have you here. It's really great to have you. And Pam?
I'm going to introduce myself on the next slide.
Oh,
are you
all right. Oh, we're not quite ready for that. Thank you for that.
Okay.
I want to make sure everybody here is, we're going to do this periodically throughout this. So if you could make sure you have your chat up. I'm wondering what was the highest level math class everybody took in high school? So go ahead and type that in the chat, hit return whenever. What's the highest level math class you had in high school? Kelly MacArthur, hey Kelly, you had calculus. We have a whole lot of calculus. Allie Lynch got to Calc 3. With somebody with trig, multivariable. There's a lot of something. Oh, I saw an integrated 4 fly by.
Saw stats.
April 4th.
Linear algebra.
We saw stats. Somebody had some linear algebra. Yeah. So we had some, yeah. Calc 1 at the local high school. Brett Kerwin took trig in high school. Somebody's questioning the question. I love that. Thank you for that. Yeah. So, trig in a small rural high school. Thanks, Amy. Group theory. Says iPad 10. Thank you for that. Like I mean, I'm trying to make at least one point with all of this. So first of all, this is a highly non-representative group. We're going to see David is going to pull some stats up later. I think if I'm remembering that's right, it's about 16% of high school students in this country take calculus in high school. I did not run the stats on what just flew by on the chat, but it was a whole lot bigger than 16%. Yeah. So with that, I want to turn this over to Pam for a second.
Is this like a pre-recorded?
No,
Oh.
it's live, but I don't have my camera.
Oh, Sorry.
There you go.
I will introduce myself when my slide comes up. I'm Pam Burden with Just Equations. I'll tell you what Just Equations is later. It's David. It's not me.
Oh, here we go. David Bersoud, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Basically, students who take calculus in high school do it for one of two reasons. Either they intend to take calculus when they get to college, and they believe that they've got to take it first in high school if they're going to have any chance of succeeding in college. I found this 30 years ago when I was at Penn State. That was the common perception among the Calculus 1 students, that unless you'd already seen it in high school, you weren't going to succeed. And the other reason, the other main reason why students take calculus in high school is because so many students are taking it in order to prepare for college, calculus in college, that it's become common knowledge that if you want to get into the best colleges and universities, you've got to have calculus on your transcript. And Dan Teague at the North Carolina School of Science and Math put it very succinctly: most students don't want to take AP calculus, they just want to have taken AP calculus. And this is reflected in various, in a variety of rates at which people are taking calculus. You want to show the next slide, Pam? So this is the percentage of students who take calculus in high school based on race and ethnicity. And what you see is that it's much higher for white students than Black or Hispanic. For Asian American students, it's extremely high. But aside from the Asian American students, it has less to do with race and ethnicity than it has to do with socioeconomic status. Would you show the next slide? So this is showing, so at least with the high schools with at least 75, back up one.
Whoops.
The students with at least 75% Black or Hispanic students, only 38% of those high schools actually offer calculus. So it's not even offered at most of the schools that are predominantly Black or Hispanic. But the real key is socioeconomic. I want to go to the next slide now. So this is looking at the percentage of students on free or reduced lunch. So those with at most 25% of the student body on free or reduced lunch, the wealthiest quartile of the schools that are out there. And what we see that in those high schools, it's over 25% of the students are taking calculus while they're in high school. Whereas once you get to the high schools where it's over 50% of the students on free or reduced lunch, we're down around 9% of the students who are taking calculus. And socioeconomic status is huge. This is from the 2013 US Department of Education data, which shows that among the top quintile of students by socioeconomic status, 37% of them had taken calculus in the graduating class of 2013. Because so many students are taking calculus in order to improve their chances of getting into the college or the university that they want access to, it's not just a question of getting calculus on your transcript. It's becoming increasingly important to have AP calculus on your transcript. And even more, it's becoming important if you really want to get into the most selective institutions to have BC calculus on your transcript. So the next slide reflects this. The percentage of students with calculus on their high school transcript who had actually taken an AP calculus exam. And by 2019, over half the students who had taken calculus in high school took the AB exam. And almost a quarter of the students who took calculus in high school also took the BC exam. Now, taking the BC exam is problematic because in many high schools, students have to take a year of AB calculus before they're allowed to take BC. And most students who are heading for BC calculus want to take the AB calculus first. That means they've got to start with Algebra 1 in 7th grade so that they can take AB calculus when they get to their junior year, and then take BC calculus when they get to their senior year. And as we know, a lot of these students then retake Calculus 1 when they get to college or university. We've got many of our best students taking 3 consecutive years of essentially the same mathematics in order to be able to really shine when they get to college or university. So the next piece, this represents a lot of double counting. And as I mentioned, in many high schools, passing AB calculus is a prerequisite for being allowed into BC calculus. The next slide has my references. And also, if you want to see these slides, they're on my website, davidbrousseau.org. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Should I just pick it up from here?
Give me
Dave?
one. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to mute everybody and then ask those of us who are on this to unmute yourselves. 1 second. All right. I think you can still hear me. And Pam, you there?
Yes.
Excellent. You're there. Thank you for that. We're going to turn. Pam's running the slides in addition to presenting here. So thank you for doing that, Pam.
And apologies for my few mistakes I made in running the
It's all-
slides, but I'm
it's all good.
improving, I'm learning. Yes, I'm with Just Equations. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Just Equations, we are a small policy institute, and we're focused, sort of laser focused on the role of math education in ensuring educational equity. I wanted to note that Veronica and I think both took calculus in high school. We are not mathematicians or math teachers or math educators. We have approached the work from the perspective of education policy and educational opportunity. And we're focusing on math because of the big role that it plays. And when it comes to calculus and admissions, in approaching this report that we're going to be talking about, we, first of all, have been aware that the math associations, a couple of math associations, have been publicly saying for going back at least 10 years that the goal of the K-12 math curriculum should not be to complete calculus. And I think David Brousseau actually had a hand in writing this statement. There's a more recent one that came out a few months ago as well, but it has a similar message. And but what we've found is that despite the fact that both colleges as well as high schools have been expanding the availability of other math options besides calculus pathway for students who may not be majoring in STEM, that we still see a lot of the patterns that David Brousseau was just talking about. And we were concerned about the role that admissions practices play in that. And that preferences may be sort of stifling these innovations. And so that's why we decided to embark on this research. And I'm now going to turn over to Veronica to tell you about what the research was and what we found.
Thanks so much, Pam. And I'll just say, when I started working on this project with Just Equations, it was the summer of 2021, and my own daughter was a rising senior, and she was getting ready to dive into college applications herself. She had decided to take a 4th year of math, and she had opted to take statistics instead of calculus. And she was starting to wonder if she made the right decision. So with Just Equations, next slide, please. We asked these questions that, were things that the quotes that Pam just showed you and the policy questions and concerns. We asked whether college admissions policies and practices, and particularly those at elite institutions, were creating barriers to change in math pathways. We also wanted to know, when we started this research, if real or perceived preferences for calculus and preferences for the math pathways that culminate in calculus are stifling innovation and opportunity in high school. And especially, we wanted to know if this was happening in college prep high schools. Now, this question is assuming that we want these new math pathways to be considered rigorous and not as something that's second tier or secondary. So these questions were the launch pad for our 2 recent reports. Next slide, please. And these 2 reports came out within the past year. A new calculus for college admissions was completed in 2021, and calculating the odds was released this year, just a few weeks ago in September. Next slide, please. So a new calculus for college admissions was the first report, and this one focused on the college admissions side of this equation. We surveyed, in partnership with NACAC, we surveyed over 1,200 college admissions officers. We heard back from about 11%, and most of them, or more than half of them, were from private institutions. We also reached out to college admissions officers and did one-on-one interviews, and most of those that we connected with here were from public institutions. Next slide, please. The second report, the most recent one, looked at the other side of this scenario. We talked to high school counselors. We surveyed, also in partnership with NACAC, we surveyed high school college counselors who work in high schools, and we surveyed independent college advisors. The response rates for both of these groups were a bit higher than the admissions officers, with 16% of high school college counselors and 11.5% of the independent advisors responding. And here too, we interviewed counselors one-on-one. And you see the breakdown here of where they were from, the public schools, private schools, and independent advisors. Next slide, please. So here, I'm going to walk through what we found. With a little preview, of course, first, with some of what we heard in doing these interviews and in comments people shared on the survey. And these are quite revealing, as you can see here. These quotes come from the research that focused on admissions officers. I won't read each one of these here, but you can see that they're pointedly focused on calculus as being a gold standard and something that applicants are recommended that they take and that they expect to see. Next slide, please. The other side of the equation, a couple of thoughts from high school college counselors. Here we see some thoughts about, it makes sense to slow down math progression, but there's a disconnect because in admissions, one of the counselors said they dinged kids who didn't have calculus on their transcript. Another counselor talked about the fact that they thought it was problematic that calculus is used as a benchmark for admissions, and they found that very frustrating. So now let's look at the survey data. I'm going to walk through sort of 5 featured findings from our surveys and our research. The first one is that calculus is not required for general admission to college. You can see here that half of the colleges responding to our survey said that they require 3 years of math. Another 38% required 4 years of math. When they did require calculus for admission, it was for STEM-related major, or sometimes for business. And even then, you only see 21% of the folks who responded to our survey had such requirements. And these requirements align with what we found on the high school survey, where again, about half of the schools said that 3 years of math were required for graduation. Another 48% said that 4 years of math was required for graduation. Next slide. So even though calculus is not required for admissions, it still weighs heavily in admissions. A slight majority of colleges who responded to our survey said that calculus gives applicants an edge in admissions all of the time or some of the time. But then the same admissions officers overwhelmingly agreed that students taking calculus in high school were more likely to be successful in college. Now, admissions officers don't say this outright. 47% said that calculus does not give applicants an edge. But one private university admissions officer told us that while their schools of engineering and business had no formal calculus requirement, these schools would not be interested in students who hadn't taken the course. And another college told us that they strongly recommend calculus for engineering, and that their engineering school would accept kids without calculus, but only if they see rigor elsewhere in the transcript. Next slide, please. Another finding, the third finding. High school counselors believe colleges expect calculus, and they recommend students take it if they want to apply to selective schools. As you can see here in these survey responses, counselors are far more likely than admissions officers to say calculus matters in college admissions. Compare the 93% here of high school counselors that say applicants with calculus have an admissions edge, compared to only 53% of admissions officers who gave that response. Next slide, please. The fourth featured finding. High school counselors told us that statistics is a valuable course for college-going students. However, they say the course is not viewed favorably in the admissions process. This is a typo here, that 86 should be a 96%. In our survey responses, 96% agreed, so nearly everyone, that statistics is useful preparation for a variety of majors. A majority say that calculus outweighs statistics, and high school stats is not as rigorous as calculus. Next slide, please. The last finding. The high school counselors have correctly pegged college admissions, because here, when we asked admissions officers to tell us which math courses carry the most weight, they focused on calculus and discount statistics. We asked them for the top 4 classes that carry the most weight in admissions. And here you see that the top 3 that got named the most frequently were all calculus or calculus, pre-calculus courses, 75%, 73%, and 50%. AP Stats made the top 4 list, but at a distant 4th place at 38%. Here's an example of one public university and what it has on their website right now, on the applications page. They say, what are we looking for in an applicant? We would highly recommend taking math your senior year and advancing through pre-calculus or calculus if available. Courses that will not fulfill this requirement include statistics, business math, and computer science. Next slide, please. Here you see a counselor commenting on the trend of high schools offering more and more advanced math courses and comparing it to an arms race. The more everyone takes, the more everyone else takes. Next slide. So I'm going to wrap up by sharing a few examples of some clear policies or statements that show admissions offices are beginning to grapple with the inequities associated with preferences for calculus. Next slide. Here you see the University of California system's requirements around math. In 2019, the UC system updated its admissions policies to clarify the range of junior and senior math courses that meet their eligibility requirements. And you see, in addition to calculus and pre-calculus, the UC specifically named statistics, data science, and other courses that are equally acceptable options. Next slide. Around the same time, Stanford University clarified its admissions language. Before 2018, Stanford specified 4 years of math, including calculus. The current language is broader and specifically names statistics along with calculus. Next slide. And this year, Harvard clarified its expectations for high school math coursework, noting that calculus is neither a requirement nor a preference for admission. So I'll stop here.
Veronica, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's amazing, amazing data. One of the things that I'm just reminded of, and I think we can, Pam, we can go ahead and stop the screen share for now. When Josh Riccio is on this call, he and I wrote a piece for the MAA, and we told the story of a student from the Rio Grande Valley named Maria who really wanted to study history. And the advice she was given was that she should take, AP calculus. And so she did. Like she worked through, she did all of this great work. And the system worked for her because she ended up getting, from the Rio Grande Valley, she ended up getting into an Ivy League school and going and studying history. And of course, she would have been much better off studying statistics because that's much more in line with what she needed as a history student. You can go read more about that on the MAA blog. I have a few questions for our panelists who are all spotlighted here, I think, and then we're gonna get. I've seen some great questions. We're gonna make sure we get those questions. David Brassoud, when we have these systems that we're all part of, we have this sort of feeling that these things have always been this way, right? And it's true. Ever since I was a kid, calculus has been sort of the end of a high school math experience, or at least the goal. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of that? How did we get to the place where calculus, as opposed to number theory or statistics or something else, is sort of the goal?
It's a great question, and it really goes back to the 1950s when there was a very active debate about what should be the mathematics that's taken by really talented high school students who want to take a college level math course in their last year. And John Kemeny, for example, Kemany's responsible for teaching linear algebra as an undergraduate course, and he really pushed for this to be part of what talented seniors should be taking. So a very large debate. But what happened was Sputnik and the need for a lot more physicists and engineers who really saw calculus as essential to what was going on. And so by the early 1960s, the MAA's Committee on the Undergraduate Program in Mathematics, and incidentally, the CUPM was a real heavyweight back in the late 50s and early 60s. It was run out of Berkeley, had many of the leading mathematicians of the time operating on deciding what should be the first year of expected college mathematics. And this is when calculus first came into being. The AP program, which started in the early 1950s, by 1970, there were less than 20,000 students taking AP calculus. It was still for a very small group of students. What happened in the 1980s and 90s was that a lot of states saw the introduction of advanced placement programs as a way of strengthening weak high schools. If they had an AP program, if they had multiple AP programs in place, that would raise the expectations for what students would be accomplishing. And in fact, to push for AP, there were many states, I know Florida was one example, some of the other southeastern states actually gave the school a bonus for every student they enrolled in an AP course. What this meant was you had lots of students enrolled in AP courses who didn't belong in AP courses, but this really swelled the numbers of students who were taking all AP courses, and AP calculus included. And so as the numbers swelled, then that increased the pressure. We've got all these students taking AP calculus. If I want to have a better chance than them of getting into my choice of school, I also need to take it. And so the enrollments in calculus really exploded in the 1990s and in the subsequent decades to get where we are right now.
Thanks, David. There's just this real tension here between this desire to sort of get ahead and this competitiveness and any sense of equity, which sort of goes out the window. David Hawkins, so you're with NACAC, you know, the college counselors and advisors. Can you talk about this tension we have, especially in the admissions process, between like wanting to have some sort of equitable admissions process, but then also people having like, you know, different people having different access and different privileges?
Yes, certainly. In fact, earlier in the conversation, when we were talking about what happened in the post sort of pandemic, post social justice crisis that is not over, of course, but post that flashpoint that we had, you know, we similarly wanted to look more carefully at everything that we do. And we actually issued a report that was supported by the Lumina Foundation back in January, where we put forward a number of recommendations that were aimed at prompting admissions offices to rethink what they do through the lens of racial equity, because we've known about these inequities for so long. And one of the observations we made was that there seems to be sort of like a sliding scale where you talk about exclusivity is literally the opposite of inclusivity, which means that as you move towards exclusivity, your risk of being inequitable also goes up. And so as we started to dig down in that, we happened upon the work with Just Equations, Pam and Veronica. We were very lucky to have them start that conversation with us at the time, because one of the recommendations in our report was that we felt like admission offices really need to take a very close look at what we ask for, what we require, what we consider, and why. So this is a perfect example of received wisdom coming down over a period of 30 plus years that admission offices tend to latch onto, because they are a very, very narrow slice of the educational roadmap that students travel on, and unless we make concerted efforts to really keep them up to date on all of the changing academic factors that we have to pay attention to, the tendency is to fall in line, because they have a lot to do in a very short time, and so they look for replicable patterns and quantifiable factors that they can examine. So for us, digging into these academic areas was a critical part of looking at this idea of exclusivity somehow, and really rethinking it. We're asking our colleges to reconsider what it means, to why they're exclusive, to reframe potentially what it is that they think makes them competitive, exclusive, whatever, and potentially even redefine, which I think really gets to this work, which is there are a lot of ways you can define talent and skill and qualification. Let's really get to those. We're colleges and universities. We have the resources to do this. Why would our admission office be using these antiquated norms to sort through students, particularly when there's such equity issues attached to them? So this is a really important and very central issue for us, and we do think that it's far beyond the time that we, as a collection of colleges and universities, really examine these questions more deeply.
Thanks very much. And I always come back to the statistic that only half of U.S. high schools offer calculus, and that number is in the low 30s if you look at schools that are serving Black and brown students primarily. You know, one of the things that we've seen out there, one of the criticisms of this is that there is a potential other solution to this, which is just to make sure everybody has access to calculus. Pam, you want to talk about like why you see that argument as not really on point?
Yes, it's a tricky argument, because we are not against people taking calculus, obviously, and we certainly wouldn't promote that to a group of mathematicians. But we are for the appropriate use of math courses such as calculus. So right now there is inequitable access to calculus, as David showed quite clearly. So while we do think the inequities in access to calculus need to be addressed, we don't think just having everyone take calculus is the solution, because it really sort of ignores the fact that there are other math opportunities, as many people have been listing in the chat, from the different kinds of math courses students could be taking, graph theory I saw, and a few others, that this current focus on calculus prevents them from accessing, or even if it's offered at their school, they don't feel the freedom to take it because they worry they won't get admitted into college. So we really think this emphasis on calculus for students who know they don't want to go into STEM. And I was such a student. I thought I was going to go into political science. I ended up going into philosophy. But either way, I wish I could have had even an option of taking anything else. But it was calculus or no math, I think, back then. So we really think it's a both and. Yes, equalize access to calculus, but not treat it as if it's the only goal of a student's math math course taking.
It's also important to realize that access to calculus doesn't mean just making a calculus course available for students in their senior year. It means preparing them. If you're going to plan on taking calculus in the senior year, that means taking Algebra 1 in grade 8. And that means being really prepared for Algebra 1 in grade 8. So having the proper preparation, having the right teachers, having the supports that are necessary to support students throughout that progression. So it's not enough just to say, let's get calculus into all of these schools. It's really a question of, well, the huge problem of equity in educational opportunities across the board, pre-K through 12.
Thanks, David. We've been at the Dana Center, we've been looking at student trajectories, and there's really interesting data out there. Like, among other things, at least in the state of Texas, there are essentially almost no poor students who are in algebra in 8th grade in time for them to go through the standard sequence and get to calculus as a senior in high school, right? Yeah. And people fall off of that track, but almost nobody can accelerate and get back onto that track. We also see in some other data, and Veronica, I want to come back to you and the research that you've done. We see this hyper acceleration that students are taking, including a significant number of students who accelerate in middle school and then don't take math in their senior year. It's accelerating so that they can, take something else. Veronica, what did the research say about all this hyper acceleration that we're seeing in terms of attitudes toward from the advisor's perspective?
Yep. Well, hyperacceleration is definitely something that we've seen, and I have experienced personally as well. My daughter went to a private school for middle school, and the pressure on the kids and the parents to figure out what track your kid is on for math was very apparent and very tangible. But there's research that has found very mixed outcomes for kids who speed through math or skip courses to get on the track to take calculus, or to take calculus even early so that they can do the A, B, and the BC courses, as we found. There's also national studies that found that even in gifted programs, that math scores just barely increase for students that are in gifted programs. And that they're also more likely to come from wealthy backgrounds. So again, we see this issue of inequity tied to kids who are placed in classes and programs and tracks that are considered exclusive or accelerated.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Veronica. And in terms of what NACAC does, as admissions counselors, how do you deal with the hyper acceleration that we're seeing? What role does NACAC see for itself in thinking through that?
Yeah, that's something that extends to pretty much all areas of college admission. There are so many ways in which the popular perception of college admission has gotten far beyond the reach of many of our members. What we try to do is we try to equip, first of all, our college advisors, school counselors, with information that can help right size the narrative. And that's important, and that can be very useful. But with a situation like this, when you're talking about a popular perception, and even a perception within colleges and universities, at least at the admission level, our function is to educate our admission office members and to prepare them to lead. Because we can talk until we're blue in the face as an association, but until the colleges start stepping out and really making it very clear, here is what we consider and do not consider, and here are all the different things you could do to demonstrate mastery or what, pick a topic that we could talk about in it, and it oftentimes comes down to the admission office leading. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to set the bar a little higher. We're trying to engage our members and really get them thinking carefully about how this issue can affect their equity goals, and how they can be the sort of the agents of change as we try to communicate to the rest of the world.
Thanks, David. And I do want to get to some questions from folks, but something that flew by in the chat was this focus, like, why are we focusing on elite schools? David, David Hawkins, can you talk a little bit about the import that elite schools have on sort of the business of college admissions?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it's a real double-edged sword, because on the one hand, we would love nothing more than to shift the focus on the vast majority of colleges and universities that don't fit into what the dean of admissions at Harvard himself said was the lunatic fringe. We would love nothing more to talk about all the fantastic work that colleges who are relatively open in their enrollment policies are doing with students. The unfortunate reality is that the media, the public, school systems, there are so many different ways in which we become hyper focused on this notion that these colleges, because they sort of pick the students from the very highest quantitative ranks of high schools around the country, that they are the best colleges, when in fact we might argue that there are colleges that are doing more with students who came from various other parts of the graduating classes, that are utterly amazing colleges. So it is the question of why all the focus on elite colleges is a bit of a chicken and egg argument. I think there are so many people who are focused on it, and the reality is that if some of these elite colleges start to change their policies, we do tend to see a cascading effect. We have seen many ways in which colleges emulate the policies and practices of more selective institutions, and there really isn't a great reason for that, other than the fact that they see, oh, this works at Harvard and Stanford and Yale, so maybe we ought to try it. And in a lot of cases, it's more complex than that. But the idea that, for instance, Harvard put this statement about what it does and doesn't necessarily prioritize in its admissions process about math curricula. When that was presented by Just Equations at a panel similar to this at our summer equity conference, every person in the room pulled their camera up and took a picture of the slide that had the Harvard statement on it. So there is some, and nobody took pictures of other slides. That was the funny thing. So that is the unfortunate reality we live in, and we do our best to balance on each side of that equation.
And just to be clear, like, there's this pull of the elite private schools, but even within publics, like, there's more attention paid to like the flagship of a state as opposed to like the smaller branch campuses. Is that right, David?
That's absolutely right. And this is one of the questions we raised in the report that I mentioned earlier: is why are public institutions hyper selective? But just precisely for that reason, that there's so much attention focused on these schools that educate a relatively small portion of the state population that they serve.
Thanks. Pam, Just Equations has done such great work with this, with these two reports that are out. Can you talk about some of the recommendations that you have? Especially, we have a bunch of math people on the call.
Yes.
Yeah, tell us what your recommendations are.
Yeah, I will, because I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to actually use a sort of a segue that was teed up by Kate Stevenson, talking about what is the quote unquote bottom 90% doing. Let me make sure I got my screen shared properly again. Yeah, and so what we found that was interesting, Veronica shared the UC systems policy, which opened up, and even before they had said that explicitly, they never expected calculus. They put out statements saying they expect calculus. When we interview counselors, they don't believe it. They say, oh, but they really do want calculus, even though they don't say so. They covertly expect it, or it's this hidden secret, which again is very inequitable because it privileges those who are sort of connected or in the know. And we want to move toward having policies be more transparent, public, like the 90%, you know, like the majority of what colleges do. So we're calling on colleges and universities to be more clear and transparent in their math expectations. If they just say take the most rigorous course, that is read as code for take calculus AB, take calculus BC, etc. And informing those policies to really engage in discussions with folks like on this, you know, folks from math departments as well as other disciplines about the, and I want to mention Kate Stevenson again as someone who's engaged in some of this in the Cal State system, to really be clear on what are the math competencies that students need to come in with, and then develop shared resources that can be available for students, campus by campus, but also shared across campus or shared by organizations such as NACAC or others that can inform also not just students, but counselors and how they're advising students. But we do think that there's a role for K-12 counselors and teachers, but a lot of this has to begin with colleges and universities making these changes or being more clear and transparent about what their policies actually are, to the extent that they aren't requiring calculus. From the perspective of K-12 schools, districts, or education departments, we encourage expanding of math offerings that to include rigorous and relevant options aligned with college majors and careers, especially to the extent that their post-secondary institutions are doing so. Improve college counseling connected to academic counseling, so students are making informed decisions and can think ahead. And those students who really do want or need to be on a STEM pathway don't find out in their junior year that they're way behind where they would have wanted to be. And also with respect to this race to calculus, we did hear a lot about the pressure that students face. And we think this is a big issue, and anything schools can do to sort of tamp that down, without tamping down students' college aspirations completely, would be certainly beneficial. And I'll just wrap this up by saying we think this discussion will continue. And this is a quote from the director of missions at University of Illinois, which was an anonymous quote in our report, but he outed himself very publicly on Twitter a few days ago as the person who said this. So we are quoting him here.
That was a lovely Twitter thread, and that's hilarious because I've only seen the preliminary version of these slides, and it was anonymous on those. Thank you for these. I want to do a quick chat blast. Here's a question for everybody. This is just a yes or no question, so it'll be pretty quick to type in. Before today's webinar, did you know what your institution said about mathematics as part of its admissions? Now, I bet some of you have looked this up since we started, but here we go. That's a bunch of yeses and then some nos. That looks a bit. Some people are just waking up because they didn't know that this was a participatory webinar here. Excellent. So this is great. In terms of if people wanted to do something, David Hawkins, this is not mathematicians aren't talking to admissions folks all the time. Can you, if somebody on this call wanted to engage with the folks in admissions at their institution, can you give them some pointers on how they would go about doing that and what would be most effective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a relatively straightforward process, believe it or not. I think as we saw at Harvard, because we were involved in that conversation between the faculty and the admissions office there, it really is almost an educational endeavor. You want to take an inquisitive approach. I think it's as easy as asking for a meeting with the dean or the VP of admission, and I think going in and talking about, look, this is what's happening in the world of mathematics. How are we, what are our guidelines? What policies are you using, and how are you training your admission reps to talk about math? I think it's helpful to connect the dots for them. In fact, I've been jotting down on this call the extensive list of resources that I want to make sure we're providing to our members on just what the mathematics community is thinking about this. So connecting the dots between if you're interested in equity, here's a place you can go through the mathematics curriculum. This is an active conversation and something that you could actually change to make things different in the way that you're evaluating students. I think again, it's doing that helps to address some of their pressure points, because all admission offices are under different conflicting mandates all the time. So to the extent that you can offer them ways to improve what they're already doing, that will be something they'll be very grateful for. And then I think finally, I would say point to NACAC. This is why we're doing this. As the professional association that represents these offices, they may or may not have heard about this conversation through us, but the important thing is we're going to keep this. We're in this for the long haul, and you can simply say, look, your professional association is talking about this and is very involved in it, and we'd love to engage with you further. So I think that's a relatively simple starting point, and you can always call on us if we can be helpful.
David, thank you so much. And for admissions having to deal with all of the different subjects, I really appreciate that you've decided to engage in mathematics, the most important of all of the subjects, as,
Of course.
as everybody maybe but yourself knows on this call. There's been so many good comments and questions that have gone through on chat, and I'm sure I'm missing some great ones. And so everybody on the panel, if there's something in there that you want to highlight, please do so. I think somebody in there had wonders if this is a symptom of a deeper problem, that the mathematics curriculum itself is grounded much more in analysis than it is in the other branches of mathematics. And certainly you hear this, people who they were good at math, but they didn't particularly love it until they got to abstract algebra or something like that. David, you might know more than others on this. What's your view on that? Is this a deeper problem of the curriculum?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And again, it goes back to the decisions made in the early 1960s, when it was decided that the focus of mathematics should be preparing physicists, chemists, and engineers. An important movement during the 1980s, trying to broaden things out and go to John Kemeny's vision of linear algebra and combinatorics and other areas of mathematics that would come into the first year and give students a much broader idea. And there are a number of places that have done this, but there's just so much expectation that the calculus analysis track is the way to get students into real mathematics, that it's totally dominated. And there are efforts that are going on. MAA certainly has been very much involved with this and continues to be, but it continues to be an uphill struggle.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, David. There's also been some comments going through about college algebra itself and the role that college algebra plays. I think within colleges, this might not be such an admissions question as like the requirements we have. And I know that there are still a whole lot of programs out there for which college algebra is a requirement. And if I'm honest, I haven't a clue why. There are all these nurses out there who had to get through a college algebra course, and when the nurse is about to shoot me up with something going into my Ivy line, I honestly could not care less if she could factor polynomials and graph quadratics. But there is a lot of mathematics I hope she has. Does anybody want to address this issue of college algebra?
Well, I'm going to go back to the 60s and the expectation that students going into a math-intensive field like the sciences or engineering would start with calculus, but a recognition that not all students were ready to start with calculus. And so the line between college algebra and pre-calculus is very vague. And it's not clear where one ends and the other starts. So that you really have to see them both as maybe college algebra is an easier pre-calculus and pre-calculus is a harder college algebra. But it really was there to prepare students who then were going to go into the calculus. And that's really the purpose of college algebra as it's taught today, is to give students the tools that they would need if they're going to pursue calculus and analysis. It is of almost no use to students who are not heading in that direction. And I know there have been studies of programs that require college algebra trying to find out where they actually use it in their subsequent courses without any success whatsoever.
Thanks for that. One of the other interesting threads that came through in chat was a question about rigor. And Veronica, I'm interested in knowing, like, in the senses in which the people in the study were talking about it. There's some sense in which rigor is just a placeholder for more elite and sort of more privileged, or just harder. What's the sense you got in these interviews? Like, in what way were people thinking of rigor?
I think I saw the spectrum of thinking on rigor, right? I mean, you had people who saw it as something that is used as a placeholder. I think I saw someone in the chat say it sometimes takes on the appearances of like a dog whistle around exclusivity. But then others would use the term rigor and they would mean, that they were looking for something that was tough and proof that kids could take on something that was challenging and do well and succeed or persevere and through to completion. So, you saw it used a lot of different ways, but it's troublesome because we're not all using the same definition for rigor. And that's where, inequity can step in and cause problems.
Thanks. And I saw there's a couple pieces that have been written about rigor. Ted Coe just posted the Ohio's definition. I think there's a Dana Center piece that Josh posted earlier. I want to bring up one last topic in the couple of seconds we have here left. And it's something that's coming down the pike that I think a lot of people are not aware of, which is there's soon to be an AP pre-calculus course. And so the College Board has planned for that, and I forget when the rollout is, but it's in a year or so. And David Hawkins, I'm really curious. To me, like, my perspective is that that's going to put more emphasis on the calculus track, and it's going to be hard for that not to just sort of make equity issues worse. It certainly makes it harder for schools to emphasize like a quantitative reasoning or a statistics path. What's the view from admissions on this issue of a coming AP pre-calculus?
Yeah, I think to answer your question, I do think it is going to make it all that much harder to sort of punch through the noise for the discussion that we're having. I think I go back to what David Bersoud was talking about how in the 80s and 90s this became a real market force. I mean, this has become institutionalized. This being the advanced placement courses, and we've gone from 20,000 odd students in 1970 to now federal and state programs that pay for students to take advanced placement classes. It has become so institutionalized, and admissions has likewise institutionalized it. So this will be a long road, and to the extent that we can get the College Board and others, the International Baccalaureate, thinking about some of these alternative, not even alternative, these different pathways to demonstrate proficiency and mastery in mathematics, that they're going to have to be part of that conversation as well. And that's something that it often takes quite a bit of time to get those wheels turning.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm with Ralph there. Why do we need an AP pre-calculus class? I would love to work on an AP quantitative reasoning class. That would be a whole lot of fun. We've come to the end of this. Julie, if you could post the link again, there's a survey. If you came to this, we would love it if you could fill out the survey about this particular webinar. I really want to thank the folks who joined us on this. David Hawkins, Veronica Anderson, Pamela Birdman, David Bersoud, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for the folks behind the scenes, Julie and others, Brooke, who were helping out to make sure this went smoothly. And finally, thanks everybody for coming to a great webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.